Jonathan Blow, welcome to the Gauntlet. How are you doing?
Hello. I'm doing well.
Congratulations on the recent release of the anniversary edition of Braid. It's
Yeah,
absolutely
that's been
gorgeous.
cooking for a long time behind the scenes, and I'm very happy that it's finally done. And well, I would be down to merely two or three projects now, depending on how you count, except that we started another one. So I'm back up to like four.
Wow.
We'll see.
I know that feeling. Well, I look forward to the sort of 700K release of The Witness as an anniversary edition in a few years.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing, which is we don't have any immediate plans to do that, an anniversary edition of The Witness kind of thing. But when you finish one, it's a natural thought like, am I going to do this for the other thing? And I don't want to do that development wise right now because I think it's more important for us to do some other stuff. And honestly, The
Hmm.
Witness is still kind of okay,
Yeah.
graphics wise and all that. But I think what we are going to do is preemptively record a bunch of commentary, maybe
Mm.
later this year, just so that, because, when we're recording Braid commentary, once in a while we'd be trying to talk about stuff and it's like, yeah, this was 14, 15 years ago. It's hard to remember, right? Whereas
Yeah.
Witness is still merely 8 years ago. So
Yeah.
I think we'll record the commentary and then keep it behind the scenes.
I always think it'd be kind of fun to embed a documentary crew inside a game studio during development, like they do with movies sometimes. And then
Well,
when it
Double
releases, you'd
Fine
have
did that.
ah, know about
And
this.
people really like these I think they have two of them, right? They have one about the development of Broken Age, and then they have, I think, a
Hmm.
Psychonauts 2 one. I haven't watched either of them because being in the games industry, I cannot bear any more of this than I'm already getting. Like, so,
Yeah.
so I don't watch these, but a lot of people who have watched them say they're quite good.
Good. Well, today we're doing something completely different, and you're taking part in my little game show, the Gauntlet.
Okay,
So
we'll see if I can survive.
we're gonna see where this takes us. Round
I,
one: music, economics, or cosmology. Which broad topic do you want to talk about?
am I trying to pick the one that I know the least about? That's actually
Well,
an
that's up to
interesting
you.
challenge
Yeah,
because I don't know a whole lot about any of these
I'll try to
things.
be generous. If you pick a direction that's challenging,
Yeah.
I'll give you more points.
Let's do cosmology. You got to go for it.
All right.
All right.
So you pick one of these and you argue for or against it. An alien civilization seeded Earth with life. Consciousness affects observations, or the universe undergoes cyclical periods of expansion and contraction.
Okay.
My tech
Wow. This
breath.
is an interesting choice. Um,
Okay.
I want to argue the middle one, but I, I, I would argue it from a standpoint of it's not the correct question. And
Okay.
but I'm gonna do the easy one about an alien civilization seeded Earth with life. Um,
Great. Are you arguing for or against?
I'm arguing for. Uh,
Okay.
now we also have to, you know, I think have a broad definition of alien civilization here, and that may comprise something that we just don't even understand. But okay, so um, this will actually, I'll make a video game connection to this as well.
Oh.
Um, but there's lots of stuff uh, about Earth that seems very fine tuned. I mean, this is one of the mysteries of all of physics, right? Is the physics of our universe seems to be incredibly fine tuned
Hmm.
for the life that we see, and so typically this is all a subject of debate or a lot of interpretation, as far as I know. But um, some people try to answer this with like the anthropic principle, right? So uh, it's it's sort of in a sense just a coincidence. We'll come back to Earth specifically in a second. It's in a
Mm-hmm.
sense just a coincidence that um, that the parameters are fine tuned for us to live. Like, and by that I mean, if certain constants of nature were slightly different, like you couldn't have molecules even, right? And like
Hmm.
the difference between that and what we have is very slight, right?
Yes.
Now, and what the people who invoke the anthropic principle there would say is, there's an immense quantity of universe out there that we can't even see that maybe has different parameters. And you just don't see it
Hmm.
because everything there is dead. And so we observe what we see, right? Okay, so you can apply that principle to Earth specifically as well. Well, there's all these planets, apparently. We didn't actually, even as recently as decades ago, we didn't know how many planets there were. Now we know there are lots of them. Most of them are probably dead or not that interesting. And but Earth, for some reason, has a lot of things tuned just right. We've got a very strong magnetic field around us that keeps everything from getting roasted all the time.
That came in
We've,
useful in the last couple of weeks.
yeah, it's very topical. But very specifically, I mean, there's all sorts of things you could point to, and you could look it up on the internet. But very specifically, actually, our moon is very important. It's a very
Mm.
large moon. I mean, compare it to other moons in the solar system. It's quite big, right?
Mm.
And it does a lot of very obvious things that seemed necessary for the dynamicity of life on Earth. For example, it's the whole reason we have tides, right?
Hmm.
And you can look up what people think Earth would be like without tides. It
Hmm.
wouldn't really work. But okay, so you could make the same argument that I was mentioning earlier about this, like, oh, it's just the anthropic principle. There's lots of planets, and we happen to be on the one that could host us, right? So that's not proof of anything. But
Yeah,
if you wanted to be
the,
sly, right?
I was going to just fill people in who aren't aware of the anthropic principle. The idea is
Yeah,
that if you've got zillions of planets, then it's not a surprise that life arises on the ones that can support life.
right. And then
Um,
if you're inside the observer, right, then you're only going to see the planets that could support life.
yes.
Okay, so if a moon is necessary to have dynamic evolution of life on Earth as fast as we've observed it, because our sun has a limited lifespan. So if evolution's too slow, for example,
Mm.
nothing happens before the sun burns out, right? So, well, how would you know it wasn't just the anthropic principle? Well, if you were making a video game or something, you might hide an Easter egg, right?
Hmm.
This is also topical, so people in the U.S. Will know that we had a quite good eclipse this year, just
Uh-huh.
recently. Now, here's the weird thing about these eclipses, right? Almost no planet is going to have eclipses the way that we have them, because what it
Mm.
requires is the moon has to be trying to explain projective mathematics without a diagram. But basically, the moon has to be the same size as the sun, very close to exactly, corrected for the relative distance at which they are, right?
Hmm.
And that is an additional numerical accident on top of everything else
Mm.
that produces these quite amazing displays of of natural phenomena. And
Mm.
as far as I've ever heard, nobody's ever postulated that this is necessary for life in some way, right? It's
No.
just this astonishing coincidence, right? It would be very easy for the moon to be a bit smaller or a bit
Hmm.
bigger or a bit further away, because if the moon were smaller, it wouldn't be able to cover the sun completely ever, right?
Hmm.
Right now, because it doesn't exactly orbit at a constant distance, and because the Earth's distance to the sun changes, actually sometimes it's too small to cover the sun projectively anyway. But a lot of the time, it covers it up, and it covers it up so exactly that you could see the corona of the sun around the sun,
Hmm.
which is what creates a lot of the amazingness of the display, right?
Mm.
And if the moon were bigger or closer, you wouldn't see that, right? So it's like it just exactly fits.
Mm.
Okay, so what's the deal with that? That's this really weird coincidence that does not seem to be required for anything and therefore is not explained by the anthropic principle. It's more you. I mean, you could think of reasons, I guess, why an additional very, very low probability coincidence would happen. But if you were making a video game level and you wanted to put in a cool Easter egg, that's one way to do it. And in fact, so the last game that I did, The Witness, has a speech in it from an older generation game. I just called him old. That's not good. But from a previous generation game designer named Brian Moriarty, who did games such as Loom and Trinity, and he had this very good speech that covers many topics, but the astonishingness of this coincidence is one of the topics. And that speech is present in its entirety in the game The Witness, although you have to work quite hard to get to it. Okay, that was, I feel like that was a longer answer than you've tuned this game show for, so I'll try to keep them briefer, but that's my answer.
I find it super fascinating, the anthropic principle in general. And in the case of the Earth being fine-tuned because there's lots of planets, I sort of see that. In the case of the universe's fine-tuning, which you briefly mentioned, you have to then propose a mechanism for producing lots of universes, and not only producing a large number, but with a vast spread of kind of initial conditions. So you're actually you're introducing quite a complicated additional requirement into the system.
It's true, but they sort of have that anyway, because originally there was the Big Bang idea that's how the universe started and that's why it's expanding. But then of course they get better at measuring the expansion, and they're like, oh, it's not just that things are flying apart, although that is happening, like with regular momentum. It's that space itself is expanding in addition to that, right? And that's, so they had to complicate all these models, and they have this thing called inflationary theory, right? And then modern versions of inflationary theory postulate that there are little mini inflationary, just call it incitement events or something, where local bubbles at different places in space might start. And then that effectively becomes a new universe, right? And some people, I forget exactly who, I'm blanking on physicist names right now because I'm so tired from video game development. But there's a sort of evolutionary component to it sometimes, where it's like, well, if you have a bubble that occurs at a fairly at a location in space-time, it's going to approximately inherit those parameters of physics from that location in space-time. So there's like whole mechanisms of all this, and they bring like fluid dynamics into it. It's nuts. People can look at that if they're interested. Now, I don't have any idea whether any of that's true. I suspect any model of the universe at that scale that we could come up with right now is very far from true. But you got to try. You got to try.
And I guess that's my other question for your answer. It's pretty difficult to judge how you kind of mentioned this. If a surprising coincidence happens in your life and you notice it, but it's very difficult to quantify the number of potential coincidences that you didn't notice not happening, right? So how do we know how many random things could have been true about the Earth?
But in order to defend my score on this moon point, right? If you go back to the anthropic principle, so you would observe that you exist on a planet that supports life, right? But you would observe that you exist on a typical planet that supports life, right? Like averaged across all the possibilities. The typical planet that supports life does not have a moon that exactly covers the sun once in a while to make a great fireworks show. That's my claim. So the anthropic principle actually kind of proves that it is engineered in some way.
Yes, the anthropic principle doesn't just imply anything that you end up with makes sense. It does actually make predictions. It says you are a normal specimen of the set of planets that produce life.
Now,
if there are things,
all this said, we don't have very good data about other solar systems, right? And we certainly haven't traveled to them. you could imagine, I don't know how this could possibly be true, but you could imagine that you travel to a bunch of solar systems eventually, or you just get very good imaging on them. And you find out that, like, really rather a lot of them have satellites that exactly cover the sun. And that, like,
Hmm.
maybe that is, for example, I don't know. I can't imagine the explanation for that.
Why it would
But if you
be?
were to observe that, it
Yeah.
would change. Then you would be back to the anthropic principle as explaining this, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, I'm gonna give you a score, and I have to take into account that this is such an interesting direction to take the question. So I'm going to give you 17.
Okay, is that a good score?
It's a pretty good score. I mean, the score is free floating. It's not out of anything.
All right.
Um, but we'll see where you end up on the high score table at the end, I guess.
Ethics,
All right.
history, or metaphysics?
Yeah. What do you fancy?
Um, let's do metaphysics, right? We're on that train.
Yeah.
We'll go.
There's no shared identity of a person over time. Time is illusory, or cause and effect is real.
I'm going to go with the easy one this time, and that's time is illusory, or
Ooh.
or at the very least, um, time is an emergent property uh, that you construct for yourself.
Okay.
Um,
I'd be interested to hear this.
yes, and we're just going to go maybe back to classic ancient Greeks like Parmenides on this
Hmm.
one, or I don't know. There are modern people who talk about this too, but um, okay. Our idea of time. We have a quite strong. We have clocks on the wall that tell us time, right? We have a quite strong idea of what it is. Um, just like we have a quite so like all these laws of physics we were just talking about.
Hmm.
We've developed our understanding of those into a quite complicated and nuanced thing. All right. Now, all of those observations that we use to um, observe that the behavior of the natural world seems consistent in certain ways, right? Which is what time is based on. Time is based originally on, like, the sun comes up and goes down, right? And we notice that
Hmm.
that's pretty regular,
Hmm.
etc., right? Um, well, clocks and calendars are, right. Certainly, you can observe that something like time is passing if you're just like in a room with no sun, I guess. But
Yeah.
so these observations, uh, this is where I'm trying to make the bridge to the point. It is very careful to do this the right way because it's very easy to, like, not be understood at all. Um,
Okay.
so these observations that we have made um, are necessarily observations of the conscious human beings that we are, right? So
Hmm.
you could imagine somehow that there's a robot that's not conscious. I don't know if that's possible, but you could just imagine it for a thought experiment, right? And you could claim that this robot analyzed the world around it and discovered these regularities and came up with a concept of time based on observing the regularities. But nobody would ever know. It would never be observed. There would never be, like, a conscious
Hmm.
witnessing of the fact that this idea of time had been created by anyone, including the robot, because we said the robot's not conscious, right? And so,
Hmm.
in order for these ideas that we build up around the world or about the world, in order for those to be built up, as far as we can understand, it requires conscious beings to do it. Okay, so then you can ask this question: what does it mean to be a conscious being? Right? We all, and this is going to be a little bit hard to convince people of in a short few minutes because it's very counter to their regular worldview. But this is a very Eastern worldview we're going to go into for a second.
Huh.
Because we all have consciousness, right? But we all ignore it. We're just used to just doing our thing, and we ignore, like, what is it the fundamentals of what's it like to be conscious, right? But if you sit there and just observe, so first of all, okay, this is one of the mistakes that could be made is let's specify what conscious means, right? It
Hmm.
just means like having an aware experience of yourself and the world around you. It doesn't mean thinking. It doesn't mean like introspecting about anything. It doesn't really involve mental activity because if you just stop thinking about things for a second, you're still seeing stuff, you're still
Hmm.
feeling stuff, and all these sensations are somehow uh, displayed to you, right? Like
Hmm.
they're happening. So
Yes.
so one way to observe for yourself, if you've never done this, exactly what consciousness is like, is you can tune into this experience of not thinking too much about stuff. And maybe this doesn't work equally well for everyone, but one exercise that worked for me is, I can ask somebody, or I could ask you the question, are you a conscious, aware being, right? Yes or
Hmm.
no. And you don't
Hmm.
answer from memory. You know from memory the answer is yes, but don't answer from memory. Just verify the answer,
Hmm.
and then hopefully most people would say yes to that.
Hmm.
Once in a while,
Hmm.
you'll get someone who's doing an obstinate, weird thing, and they'll say no. But most of us would say yes. And then
Yeah.
and so then the thing is, when you check in on your experience and then say yes, the next step is like, okay, do that again. Check in to make sure you're a conscious, aware person, but just stay there a little bit longer, right?
Hmm.
Just stay there and see what it's like. But answering that question with evidence, with your own subjective evidence,
Hmm.
is sort of the gateway into this more immediate experiencing. And so when you do this, right, there are some things that become very clear right away, which is that you're having an experience in the present moment.
Hmm.
You have an idea about the future, but those are mental ideas. Those are thoughts that come into your mind, plans, or things you're worried about, or whatever. And you can see the thoughts, right?
Hmm.
Or in your mind's eye, or somehow they get vocalized, right? These thoughts come into your mind, but they always come into your mind in the present moment.
Hmm.
You can't be in the future experiencing a thought about the future. It's an idea that happens to you now, right? And it's the same thing about the past, right? So you may believe that the past happened, but that's a belief. You may have memories of things that happened, but you can't experience a memory in the past. You can only experience it in the present, right? So you have some
Hmm.
idea in your mind about what you had for breakfast this morning, and that's happening now when you think about it, right? And so the only thing that we can ever experience is right now. That's it.
Hmm.
Um, and that's just very interesting. It's a very interesting thing to delve into and dwell upon. And you could imagine a model. There are all sorts of models of the universe that you could imagine that play around with these ideas of causality and free will and whatnot, right? And some
Hmm.
of them have another way that I could have argued this same point in a different direction is the Einsteinian like four-dimensional block universe, right?
Yeah,
Which
I
is
wondered if you
probably
were going
where
to go
most
that way.
people would take it. And we could also, if I get bonus points, we could do that, but it would make the answer really long, right? Um,
I'd
um,
be interested to touch on it in a minute.
yeah,
I had a thought that links what you were just saying with the previous round that I thought
yeah.
might be interesting to bring up.
But
Have you
but
heard of?
just
Oh, go
let
ahead.
me just finish the point because I
Yes,
just a couple more sentences.
go
So
ahead. Yeah.
with the Einstein version that maybe more people are familiar with, there's this thing where everything just the future exists and the past exists, and just somehow you're on some world line that goes through there, and somehow that's not exactly explained in physics really yet.
Hmm.
Um, you experience one of those moments at a time seemingly, right? But if you step outside and look at that, all those things exist eternally, right? And so they're sort of always happening. And so even in the Einstein version of this, it's like the thing that actually causes you to feel like you're experiencing moment to moment in sequence is a subjective phenomenon that's just some kind of invented continuity of your mind that's like, because I remember a past, that past must have happened just a few seconds ago, right? I just took a drink of this. I remember that, right? But actually that moment is there eternally, right?
Mhm.
In the Einstein model. And so the idea that it just happened a minute before this one, I mean, what does that mean? You could draw out, there's like some line segment in space time that means like a minute ago from here, but
Mm.
they both really exist all the time. And then what I'm saying about
Mm.
the conscious subjective model of reality is like that but different. It's saying that maybe the past and future don't really exist at all because you don't need them, because all you actually know is right now. But
Mm.
if you wanted to, you could again imagine all these moments sort of existing eternally at the same
Mhm.
time. And then it seems to us like these happen in sequence, right?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I want to dig into the. I feel like there's almost a contradiction between those two perspectives. I'll get back to that. So
There
the
is,
first
yeah,
thing,
they're definitely not saying the same thing.
yeah. Have you heard of Boltzmann brains?
Oh, yes.
The so the For the audience, then the concept is that if you consider the different ways that a conscious brain could come about in the physical universe. One way would be that a part of the universe develops in a way that can produce the environment necessary for evolution. And over the course of millions of years, you eventually increase the amount of intelligence and reach us. The other way would be because you can have in empty space, you can have these quantum events where particles will just appear out of out of the void and then disappear a moment later. It's conceivable, although highly improbable, that an entire brain could form in the in the emptiness of space. And if the brain on its own is capable of conscious thought, it's just as conscious in the middle of space for an instant as it would be inside your skull in a permanent way. And the argument is this physicist Boltzmann argued that actually the improbability of the the environment that we see around us is so great that you'd actually expect a higher number of the conscious beings to be these Boltzmann brains. So we experience our current moment, as you were saying. We don't actually know whether our memories and our expectations of the future are true. So we we are just randomly picked from the sample of brains that could be experiencing that. And if the maths is correct, we then have to conclude that we actually are a Boltzmann brain and all of our memories are false and we are
Yeah.
about to break out of existence in a
Well,
millisecond.
except not really, because another Boltzmann brain with the next moment of experience would arise at some point in space, not necessarily continuous with the previous, like not in the same place or time. It might be billions and billions of years later in
Mm.
17 galaxies over, but that
All
combination
possible
would
brains
arise.
having all possible
Yeah.
experiences
Here's
appear at
so one thing
evenly
about this
distributed.
Boltzmann brain idea that's extra, because uh, when you first start thinking about this, it's like, well, actually, if you try to put together what is the probability of any particular thing this complex arising due to quantum field fluctuations, which is what they're talking about. It's just an astonishingly low probability, right? But the thing is, as you think about what happens when the universe gets really old and entropy goes up and you kind of can't have regular life anymore, and you kind of
Right.
can't even have, like, planets don't exactly hold together anymore because everything is spreading out to a
Like
uniform.
post heat death of the universe, if you can
Yeah.
still have these quantum brains appearing.
Well, you could, and in fact, as far as I know, the fluctuations happen at the same rate as now, even though
Mm.
macroscopic time is slowing way down, because as the universe gets older and older, like it takes longer and longer for anything interesting to ever happen, right? And
Yes.
so you look at these people, they have this thing where they measure the age of the universe on like time scales that just get exponentially they keep replacing the units, right? As so that it's
It's
just
like double
exponentially
arrow
longer. And
notation. Yeah.
and as you go to those time scales, then actually Boltzmann brains become quite common and frequent
They
because
eventually become 99.999% of the brains because you've got
yes,
infinite time. So
yes,
the small amount of time where interesting things were happening at the beginning of the universe
yeah,
dwindles into insignificance.
yeah. No, that all that is true, and this is the fun. I mean, there's all these things in physics that are compatible with mankind's current knowledge of physics, and also are the total drug trip things to think about, right? Um,
Yeah.
I don't take Boltzmann brains too seriously on their own, for the following reason, though. Um, Not because it's not necessarily right, but because there's so many other infinities going on at the same time that that one almost
Mm.
doesn't matter, right? So
Hmm.
like if the universe is either infinite in either spatial extent or in temporal extent, right? Which
Hmm.
a lot of people believe one or the other of those is true. Um, Either one of those, right? There's this thing called the pigeonhole principle that says
Mm.
that uh, you have to repeat somewhere later in space or later in time because there, even though there's an enormous number of possibilities of how matter could be arranged, or let's not even say you plus your observable everything you can see and hear right now and whatever,
Mm.
that's
Mm.
a finite amount of stuff. It's a very large amount of stuff, but it's
Mm.
finite. And so if there's any infinity in any direction, then that repeats. And if it repeats, it not only would repeat exactly, but would repeat slightly off. In fact, there would be way more slightly off versions than exactly the same versions. And this is one way
Mm.
that you get a multiverse concept, right? But then another way that you get, and that doesn't require quantum mechanics or anything. That was true from the physics we knew in the 1800s. Is as soon as we knew about atoms and stuff. Um, but then also, quantum mechanics gives you another set of infinity, actually multiple different sets of infinities of like how things could repeat and duplicate. And so I think given if you're going to adhere to this kind of you know materialist model of the world, which I don't. People say that they're materialists, but I don't even know what materialist is supposed to mean exactly.
Mm.
Sometimes you could replace that word with physicalist, meaning like I believe that the laws of physics just determine the reality of the universe or something. But the laws of physics are so crazy, given how we understand them, that you sort of have to, or at least this is my way of understanding it. You sort of have to come to the conclusion that whatever experience you are having is explainable via many multiple different things, all
Mm.
of which seem to be happening at the same time. And so you kind of can't decide which one is generating the experience that you have because they all are.
Mm.
Which at that point, what do you even do? Right? Well, we just do what we were going to do anyway is the answer.
Yeah, maybe. So just to put a dot on this general relativity versus the existence of present moment. My understanding is that at least under general relativity, there is no coherent concept of a present moment. You can't say that two events are truly coincidental if they're non-local. Um, so
Right.
we all have the perception because of our everyday experience that you could press pause on the universe and wander around and see the current state everything is in,
Yeah.
but all that would really be is an arbitrary reference frame, like a slice through the four-dimensional universe. In reality, time is not passing in this uniform way throughout all of space, and
Yeah.
you can come up with kind of reductio ad absurdums to show that this is the case with the maths of general relativity.
Yeah. And this is one of the things, by the way, that I think torpedoes simulation theory. You know, these people who say like, "Oh, the
Interesting.
universe is a simulation," because you can't, because they have this picture that there's a now going
Mm.
1 minute to another,
There's like
and
a game loop running across the whole of
yeah,
reality.
but that's not the physical universe that we observe. There is no simultaneity really. We just kind of mostly kind of have simultaneity, right?
Mm.
And so, uh, you know, I mean, you can, if you want to believe in simulations, then you can try to come up with some crazy system that like computes ahead in certain areas where things are happening that would be non-simultaneous and whatever, but like I don't think it really works. And so I don't know. I have a whole like hour-long speech I want to do sometime when I have time again about why simulation theory doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of different reasons why. There's not even just one. And but people are so convinced by it, and it's just this thing where it's like, you know, we always historically like to explain things in terms of what we understand right now, and the new thing that we understand is computers. So
Mm.
we explain
Well,
things as computers, and it doesn't really work.
I do think game developers have a unique insight into the simulation hypothesis because they do nothing all day but make the simulation,
Yeah,
and therefore are very aware of its kind of limitations, not
yeah,
just limitations based on current hardware, but kind of deep technical limitations
yes.
that
And
couldn't be
so
overcome.
once in a while, like I just saw this the other week on Twitter. I don't remember who said it, but somebody brought up this idea that floats around like, oh, you know, it seems very likely that we're in a simulation because the laws of quantum mechanics and stuff that are just like what you would do in a video game to like be efficient. Like you wouldn't render things that are behind you and whatever. And it's like, sounds plausible if you don't know anything about making video games, but when you do, none of that makes any sense actually, right? And
Right.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah. All
Yeah,
right.
but yes, just to bring it into land, then the
Yeah.
problem is that consciousness, like my experience of self, when you were talking about doing those kind of mindfulness experiments,
Yeah.
is very much an individual, single, non-divisible self, and yet,
Yes.
if the brain is producing this consciousness as an emergent property, you have to even understand that time is not running the same in one half of your brain to the other and various other things. So if it
Well,
is an emergent property, it doesn't share any of the qualities of the physical object that's producing it.
I will just say about that that even though it seems to be the in vogue belief among scientifically educated people in that consciousness is produced as an emergent property of the brain, um, that has not been a belief that anyone held really for almost all of human history. And um, it's quite a new idea. And so you could just believe that you've got everything right and that this new idea makes sense. Except
Mm,
that, you know, it doesn't make sense to me, right? So
mm,
consciousness is so obvious, right? Like it's a fact that it is here, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so when I
It,
try
it's
to,
it's more obvious than any other fact in some ways.
well, and in fact, what I was trying to say at the start of this answer is that it's prior to any other fact, because the only
Yeah.
way that you know the result of any measurement or observation is through consciousness, right?
Mm,
So so
mm,
the thing is, uh, I don't see how you could take, if again you have some, if we go back to the, for example, the mechanical universe idea of the world from like the 1800s, where like molecules are like little balls on sticks and they're connected to each other or whatever.
yeah.
If the universe is a bunch of that moving around and there's no awareness or consciousness in there, right? You have to explain to me how you go from that. It's just like, well, we just have a whole lot of these Tinker Toys on sticks. And then eventually, and this is where it gets confusing because people say, and then eventually things could think and do computations. And it's like, maybe, but thinking and doing computations are not consciousness. Consciousness is a
Yeah.
different basic fact. And so you
Yeah.
have to explain how you
Yeah.
get this fundamental thing from something that doesn't have it, and that doesn't, to me, make any sense. And honestly, when you talk to, people who are well educated, it doesn't make sense to quite a few people. But
Mm.
it's one of these social phenomena where there's no real advantage in talking about it, right? So just the people who are loud sort of win the public opinion.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's incoherent. I mean, you can run so like a Turing machine, you
yeah,
can run that based on having a chalkboard, a bunch of ones and zeros, and like a
yeah,
laminated state machine.
yeah,
If you're running your own brain on a giant chalkboard, where does the consciousness happen? What happens if you rub out some of the zeros and replace them with ones? Like,
yeah. I mean,
where does consciousness come in? Yeah,
these are dangerous arguments, though. I mean, I agree that that's a useful thing to think about, but at some point, scale gets confusing. So that's kind of equivalent to Searle's Chinese room argument, which I got beaten over the head with in college because I went to Berkeley, and it's not that relevant of an argument anymore because it was sort of about intelligence rather than consciousness, and we have AIs kind of now that are way
right.
better than what they would have thought of, but in fact, the Chinese room experiment is about, automated translation of English to Chinese, and we have things that just do that now, right? So it's like not a big deal to us in
Yeah,
the same
but the
way.
Chinese room
Um,
experiment, in some ways, is a counter to an like a possible way that you could try to detect human-like intelligence, and it's kind of saying just because you could do a Turing test on something doesn't mean that it's actually. In some ways, it's I think ineffectively hinting towards the conscious experience part of the Chinese room experiment. In some ways, is a philosophical zombie where you could ask the Chinese room, "Are you conscious?" in Chinese, and it would tell you back yes in Chinese.
yeah,
But
I mean,
it's
the counter argument that I always heard to that whole thing, which honestly I haven't spent that much time thinking about it because it
yeah.
seems like an old argument that's not really that relevant,
Mm,
but
mm.
the argument was, in order to, because okay, so half the people have no idea what we're talking, more than
True.
half. But the idea is just
Seriously, googling while we talk.
there's somebody inside a room. That person doesn't know Chinese at all, right?
Yeah,
Or you could imagine that it's a robot for a more modern version of the thing, right? But the
yeah,
robot doesn't know Chinese, and
yeah.
it just follows instructions in a book, which is a computer program. And the book says, like, when you see this character, do this, right? If this was the last character and whatever. And the thing is, that's exactly a large language model, actually, kind of. I mean, not we encode it neurally instead of as a list of instructions, but you
Yeah.
can you can represent any neural network as a list of instructions. In fact, that's how the computer's doing it, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it's one of these things where we've just overtaken the argument. But the thing that I always heard argued about that was just that in order for those instructions to actually convince the person outside the room that this was working, they would
Yeah.
have to be so immense that there essentially was a back channel to the author of the instructions, like
Right.
pre-encoded, because it wouldn't, like, the idea that it fits in a book is a misleading thing. It would have to be like, I don't know,
Mm.
like a, you know,
I mean,
city-sized thing of
yeah.
books.
Like
And of
if
course, the thing is, we have those now. So
if an alien civilization sent a rocket ship that contained some sort of equivalent of a GPT that they had constructed, and we talked with it, we'd learn a lot about the alien civilization that had sent it over, even though we weren't talking to them directly. It would be an extremely efficient way of communicating across interstellar distances to just exchange like GPT models back and forth.
yeah,
Okay, let me give you a score, which feels ridiculous,
okay,
but that is
that's what we're doing.
that's the structure I've
I
set
make
up.
video games. I'm used to having stuff that I do get scores. I don't pay any attention to them though.
No, that's the right attitude. Some of my audience has found this process very stressful.
18. That's even better than last time.
Exactly,
All
you're
right.
only getting better. Cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology.
Okay. Um, I think we could lighten up on the bong toking for a bit. So let's do cinema and theater.
Great. Okay. Cinema is most important for its visual spectacle. Music is the most important element of a film, maybe in contrast to the first one. And then adaptations, sequels, and remakes stifle originality.
I mean, I think everybody's convinced of the third one, so we don't need to talk about that at all. I'm going to break the rules of the game.
Okay.
I'm going to argue the first two of these simultaneously
Wow.
with one argument that is deeper than both and
Okay.
attacks both. And this is
I'm going to have to click the third one to highlight the first two.
okay. Well, hopefully this does not affect my all valuable score.
Let's see.
Okay, so what's fascinating about film to me, right, is, well, what is it? And if you start answering this question without thinking much, you're like, well, it's storytelling where you watch a thing, right? And it's like, okay, but we have all these other forms of storytelling. And this particular one has been tremendously successful, right? And why is that? Well, I mean, you can spend billions of dollars to make robots on the screen that shoot at each other, and people love that. But why? Why is that what makes it successful? And to me, what is fascinating about it is the way in which you can make an experience that is well put together, extremely curated in how it passes from moment to moment, say. Even though time is illusory. And which reaches parts of our mind that we love to use, like parts of our mind, like if you're just out walking down the street and you see someone that you know and they're having some kind of a moment, they don't see you and they're having some kind of a moment of like being frustrated. Like we watch people and we figure out what's going on with them and like we experience their thing. And large parts of our brains are just very interested in doing this, right? And so film gives us a way to have a premeditated version of that, where there's a presentation that has visual spectacle, for example, things that you normally would not get to observe if you were just walking down a street in your town. Also, you know, music synchronized with this visual spectacle to heighten the experience, right? But then also, you know, combined with some dialogue and, you know, plot and things. And what I'm actually going to argue, though, is that the dialogue part, the words part, is less important than the other things. It needs to be there because not that many people really want to watch a film that doesn't have that at all. But it's more like a superstructure or a scaffolding in which the visual and the audio elements fill it out to make what people really value. And the way you know that is just, you know, nobody goes to see a movie with like a black screen with just someone talking for 2 hours. That's not a thing.
You mean
and then-
Oppenheimer?
Well, sort of. And so, and this is what's very interesting to me. Like in some sense, what I did in video games during the time when I was working on The Witness was sort of meditating on this kind of nonverbal part of the experience, the visuals and the audio and like the information that our brain gets from those things. And then saying, how can I learn from that? And how much more can I do nonverbally inside a video game? That was a really interesting process. I'm not doing that now. The new game is a totally different thing, but it's just really interesting. Like nonverbal communication is quite fascinating, and I think has a great deal of potential, both for games, but really all media and for human communication, right? So, you know, they say, I forget, everybody always has different numbers about like what percentage of your brain does whatever and all these things. But one of the figures that is not disagreed with in principle, although the number varies depending on who you're talking about, is like if you're just standing there talking to somebody, right? How much of the bandwidth of the communication is happening in the actual words that are said, as opposed to the
Mm,
body language and the intonation of the words and all these things. And, it's generally people say between 5 and 15% of the information content
wow.
is in the words, right?
Huh.
And so now that's not to really diss words because words are an amazing technological innovation. First spoken words, like at some point we didn't have those and it was
Hmm.
probably a lot harder to organize anything. Um, and then eventually written words, right, which persist over time. And the thing is, we've gotten a tremendous amount of utility out of written words. Um, but at some point, that has allowed us to develop technology to the point where we're in a position to explore what other kinds of communication you can do without written words again, right? And film is one example of that. Games are another example, and I look forward to seeing more examples. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's what I
I,
have to say about film.
I was thinking about games versus films, and in some ways they are both examples of using as many senses and approaches to creating an experience as you can, but they divide over the question of whether or not they are interactive. And it feels like they serve different purposes. It is not that one is better than the other. And actually, in a way, to again link it back to some of the stuff we were talking about before, when we experience life in a um, in a thoughtful way, I think it is more like you're on a ride or a roller coaster um, than we maybe think in a superficial way. We feel like we have a lot of agency and we're making choices all the time. But in fact, a lot of the stuff that happens to us, even things that were driven by us but came out of an emotion that was triggered by an event that happened in our past, that was from a historical event that have influenced us. We are much. I think we're much less agentic in our own story, and almost um, our greatest influence on our experience of life is um, the storytelling that we do about our own experiences. So you'd think that a movie would not relate well to us compared to a game. Surely an interactive experience resonates with human more strongly, but actually, what a movie is doing is giving you a perspective and a curation of experiences, and
Yeah.
it's a product that's being handed to you as, consider this. The artist behind the movie has put together a package of complete decisions, and now you can all, everyone in the audience has had the exact same like deep exploration of some aspect of humanity given to them to discuss. Whereas a game, by its nature, different players will use the game in vastly different ways, and it's therefore much less of a shared community experience to discuss. The more interactive a game is, the less in common the players and the fans of the game have with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been a point of discussion among game designers for a long time. At least it used to be. I feel like game designers these days are, I don't know what happened. I don't see much interesting conversation about game design among designers anymore.
Yeah.
It's all about identity politics or whatever now.
Uh,
Hopefully that'll, eventually return to something else. But yeah, it's difficult actually, right? Because if games don't have something that's their own aspect of the medium that other media don't have, there would be not a real point to games, right? But we know they do, right? They have this interactivity thing. But so then the way I've always thought about it is for games to be strongest, right? And to really achieve their potential as a medium, you want to really explore what that interactivity can do
hmm.
and really figure it out. And that's part of what I've been trying to do as a designer, is like just push on the boundary of like, what do we understand about game design? Now,
Mm.
there's a counterforce to that, uh, which is, um, there's all this spectacle. Games have their own version of spectacle, which often requires a high budget, you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
and high budgets lead people to be very conservative about getting that money back. And what that has meant in our current game industry for a long time has been that we make something that's a lot like an action movie. It's basically
Mm.
copying, like you play like an Uncharted game or something. It's
Yeah.
literally trying to be a movie, but then there's interactivity in between the movie clips, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
obviously that's very successful financially, which means a lot of people enjoy those games and want to play them. And I don't really have a problem with that at all. But to me, it's the problem is if you keep gravitating toward movie and not toward figuring out really what are the best things about games,
Mm.
you may never figure out what are the best things about games, right?
Yeah.
And
It
it's hard.
actually
It's
feels
hard
like.
though, because so the curation that you're talking about that happens in movies is very valuable and very real, and
Mm.
um, and it's hard to curate interactivity. It's you have to step back and make systems that have a point to the system that people will see if they play with the system a long time. It's like a
Mm.
lot more subtle, and it doesn't tend to generate billions of dollars
Mm.
right now. So
I would almost want to classify some of these basically on rails shooters more in the same category as movies. If the point of the experience is that you're having something that's full of pre decided moments, and everybody has the same flow as they go through it, and then you're adding on top of that a little moment of interactivity, like you're you're sprinkling in some of the, there's a hedonistic aspect to doing some of the tangible things that you could do in a game without that having to be the thing that steers the meta experience. And on the flip side, so I think something like Minecraft is probably, holding the torch for it's the I think still the most popular game for people below a certain age, and is largely used like a box of Lego, I think. So
well, that's
now.
really interesting. Like Minecraft is one of the few. Well, okay, there are actually a few examples. So Minecraft is one. Roblox is another one. Tremendously
Mhm.
popular. Not trying to be a movie. Real. I mean, you could make something in Roblox that's trying to be a movie.
Yeah.
And then Fortnite as well is like
Mm.
not trying to be a movie. And
Yeah.
so all three of those
Yeah.
games are like among the biggest games in the world. Maybe each of those was the biggest game in the world at some point in time. I don't know, but they were all
Mm.
very close. I mean, Minecraft definitely was the biggest game in the world at some point.
Mm.
And so that just shows you that there is a great deal of potential outside the trying to be an action movie model, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that model is starting to die now because I kind of feel like there aren't as many games trying to do that now.
Mm.
Although
The other
maybe
thing
most
that
of them just died because the budgets were too big. Like,
I think
I
the
don't
other
know.
thing that's massively driving game design is streaming. A lot of people are watching people, so it's the strange combination of there is a game, there is a real person playing the game, but most of the audience are watching it as a movie. It's closer to sport in a way, where you've set up the guidelines, and then people tune in and want to know if their protagonist is going to win the sporting event. Um,
Yeah. And of course, in order for a game, like games that work better on streaming are games that have a lot of gameplay, right? That will go differently each time the streamer sits down and does it, right?
mhm,
So single player
mhm.
games where you play through a plot, they tend to not be that long. Streamer runs out of stuff to play after one or two sessions and is on to the next game.
Yeah.
Whereas, something like I don't know, Fortnite or Escape from Tarkov or something, is like
Uh,
they're playing that for a long time, and it's much easier for it to both for it to become popular because it gets more exposure, but also for people to get invested in what they're seeing because they've seen this person play this game a bunch of times. They know pretty well how it goes. That's another thing that I'm fascinated by is like the model of the universe of the game that you build in your mind that enables you to
hmm
understand the subtler aspects of what's happening, right?
hmm
Like if you tune in and you watch someone play a game for the first time and you've never seen this game before, you kind of could tell what's going on, but there might be nuanced things that are occurring that are quite important that you won't pick up on yet. But
Yeah.
you build that model, and that's really interesting to me.
I remember playing Half-Life and stopping. There's kind of an implied world where there are lots of characters running around, but if you stop and wait, nobody will appear. Like
Yeah,
they only spawn if you progress through the level, and that completely destroyed my kind of immersion. Like some part of my brain had bought into the illusion. This was a long time ago, right? I'd kind of bought into the idea that I have to keep running. This is urgent. And once you realize, oh, I can just stop at any point and just stand for an hour and nobody will
yeah,
come through. And because your brain is now perceiving the actual interactive experience rather than the interactive experience that the designers were trying to pretend that they were delivering, right?
yeah. And
Um,
that one's hard. So in Half-Life One, the beginning of the game is there's this lab accident, and the lab is like exploding, and people are in danger, and all this, and so it's generating this feeling of urgency. That's a thing that video games do. And the problem you have as a designer is if you actually make people lose in something like that if they're not that fast, that could make the game pretty hard, right? In a way that you don't need. But I also don't feel like you should do that. Like Half-Life is a very old game. So back then it's fine, but I think if you make a game now where you pretend like there's time pressure but there isn't, I think that's
mm,
bad because I think players see through it. Now, of
mm,
course, a lot of games not only do that, but they do the even worse version of it where it's like, you know, there's pretend time pressure, but
yeah.
there's also like weird collectibles and like bags of gold or whatever that you're trying to get. And it's like, oh, I missed that. Let me retry this jump 10 times, like while the
Yeah.
nuclear power station is melting down, right?
Yeah.
And games do that all
Well,
the
people
time,
always
and it just
talk about,
shatters it.
yeah. Bioshock was criticized a lot for this, the like ludonarrative dissonance of like
Yeah.
how can you go from a moral quandary into now I'm just gonna blast a bunch of people into pieces for points and then
Well, I mean, for me, Bioshock 2 was really the epitome of that because it's not only that. Not only are the enemies just like a bunch of guys, right? Just like you. But like it's got all these animations of extreme gore. Like it's delighting in the fact that you're because you use these
yeah,
little rail things to move around, and then you can like stab a dude in the face with like the spinning buzzsaw, and it's just really
yeah,
it's obviously delighting in the violence and which is mostly kind of unjustifiable. And I don't know. That said, I mean, Ken Levine is one of the game designers that I actually respect. It
yeah.
might not seem like it because I'm on record as saying stuff about Bioshock games, but like there just aren't that many designers anymore who are going to make their thing that they care very much about. They're working very hard to like make sure all the parts of it are right and good. Um, and that have kind of original ideas in the first place. Like that's all, those things are all very rare. And so
Mm,
anytime you find that in a designer, well, and so all that plus like isn't being, totally censored by whoever is paying for the game. Right. Um,
yeah.
so that's very rare. And I think we should value that anytime we get it.
I think you have to have a love and fondness for Bioshock 2 for trying to do something kind of interesting and groundbreaking, trying to think about things not just for profit, not just for entertainment value, but like really digging into ideas and like whether or not it was a perfect result, whether or not Ken Levine was right on his perspectives of the things he was doing. I just have a lot of time for that. As that, it's almost you want to find a term for that is not games. It's like a thing that some game designers are doing that is elevated above the entertainment value.
I will tell you, when you're a designer who's so what I do is pretty different from what Ken Levine does, right? But it's similar in the sense that there's hardly anyone else doing what I do either, right? And it feels pretty lonely sometimes. Like you're in this entire industry and most people are making, pretty generic games. I mean, if you go on Steam or something like that right now and you just say, what are all the new games that are out? They might be interesting in the sense that like it's a fun game that's a riff on something you've heard of before and it's like executed a little bit well or something. But almost never do you see a game that's doing something new in the realm of ideas at all, right? It's incredibly rare. So, yeah, I mean, again, anytime someone's doing that, I'm on their team, and in fact, it's very hard. Like it's so hard to make a game that's doing new idea stuff compared to because a game that already exists and you just want to make a better version of it. There's a blueprint right there. You just copy the whole blueprint and then you just make the things different that you want. But as soon as you're out in a different territory of ideas, there's all these things that existing games do that don't work for your game because it's philosophically important, say, for your game to do things a certain way. And so you have to figure out how to make that happen. And there's just all sorts of problems that you have. And then if you manage to finish the game, then you've got to get people interested in it and wanting to play it. And all these things are very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I think the number of people who are doing game design, well, the total number of people who are doing it at a big scale is obviously already quite small. But then it's similar to film directors, I think. Lots of films come out. Very few people are thought of as Alfred Hitchcock or Stanley Kubrick. And their ideas are still quoted decades and decades later because they had an interest in cinema in a sort of meta purist way, as well as trying to produce high quality stuff. So I think the reason there are so few people thinking as deeply about games as you is just because that's true in any artistic discipline. There's a lot of people who want to make their own version of an artistic thing that exists. There's very few people who can both kind of perform at a high enough level to have people listening to them and want to think at a high enough level to push the art form forwards. So if it makes you feel less lonely, I'm sure people will be quoting your thoughts on the subject of video games for many, many decades to come. Even if your contemporaries are not always on your level.
Yeah, I mean, it's I have quite a few, well, not quite a few. I have a small circle of friends who are all doing their own interesting things design-wise. It's just, it takes some of them a really long time to make a game. So, that's the other difficulty of our times is games, the more interesting games are, like I said, the harder they are to make, which means the longer they take to make, which is rough. It's very rough.
Yeah, and there are a few interesting games that have stuck with me that you could implement them in an afternoon, which is also interesting in a different way. There's games that are just a few sprites and a couple of rules, and they leave you with a real. They kind of hit you in some really pure interactive way.
Yeah.
But by definition, the number of such games that are left for people to make dwindles quite quickly.
Yeah, although, I used to think that, but I feel like now we're just not very good at finding those. I bet there's a whole lot of them. And we just don't think about it enough.
Well, there's always like the Flappy Bird phenomenon, right? A thing that somebody can make in a day.
That's one of the simplest games
goes around the world.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that Flappy Bird is a very interesting game intellectually, ultimately,
Mm.
but it is very interesting that with approximately the most minimal rule set, you could
Mhm.
make something that a lot of people wanted to play, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Right. I'll give you a score for this round. I'll tell you what. Let's give you 17 again.
All right.
Round 4. By the way, there are 6 rounds in total.
Okay.
So I guess we'll end up doing about 2 hours if that's okay with you.
That's good. Yeah.
Psychology, elite theory, or theology.
What is elite theory?
So there's a bunch of thinkers who got called the kind of elite theorists, and their
Okay.
view was a bit sort of cynical about politics. I guess you could think of them as Machiavelli and his descendants
Okay.
intellectually.
I mean,
Um,
I don't know anything about that. So,
you're curious.
well, we could do that. Or we could
I
do
can
like
try and roll back
psychology.
if you don't like the questions.
Let's do psychology since that's something I actually think about sometimes, even though I have no education. Oh, so let's not do the free will because that's very adjacent to the consciousness thing, and rather than have it be a one note discussion.
True.
Eyewitness testimony should not be permissible in court. Individuals use their moral compass in group settings. I mean, I don't think the second one makes any sense. So,
You want to keep eyewitness testimony around.
well, just as a practical matter, what else are you going to do? You know,
We could take the second as an opportunity to talk about the legal system more broadly, if you've got thoughts on that.
I'm not sure that maybe this will be one of the shorter answers, and that's fine
Okay.
because, yeah. So here's the thing, right? Like, because I'm a programmer, I think about things this way. Aspirationally, what a legal system is trying to do is it's got these laws, these documents that state what's supposed to happen. And those are supposed to sort of be like computer code in that they solve this problem of making the right thing happen.
Mm.
Given the input, it's supposed to produce the best output, right? And of course, we all know it doesn't come anywhere close to that.
Mm.
But, uh, part of that is just because this is the reality that we have to deal with is very messy and uncertain, right? And that's why all these legal processes are the way that they are. In fact, here, so in the U.S. here, I've been called into jury duty before,
Oh yeah.
and I was not deemed a suitable juror
Oh no.
because I made clear my intent to. So when you go in there, one of the things that they say, both times that I've been in, one of the things that they say is, you know, um, given, I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but they basically say, uh, do you promise to cast your vote as a juror uh, according to the instructions of the judge and sort of the infrastructure that we have here,
Huh.
and not according to your own personal feelings about the people
Wow.
involved or the laws
Huh.
involved or whatever. And I said, no,
Interesting.
like if I think a law is unjust,
Yeah.
then I'm
Then you'll
going to
claim
let the
their
guy
innocence.
off, right?
Interesting.
Because
Which
because I think that's why. So you have this whole question like why. I know legal systems are tremendously different
this
in
is
different
jury
countries.
nullification, is it not?
You could call it that, but I think it's a more nuanced version of it, which is just
Okay.
because if you say I'm going to go jury nullify, that's sort of that's obstinate in a certain way. But the way that I think and in a way that could be seen as like being in contempt of court or something, but they're not
Sure.
allowed to say that. But
Yeah.
but the way I think about it is just like, look, the reason in the U.S. we have this system where you get tried for certain classes of crimes, you get tried
Hmm.
in front of a jury of your peers, and like, why is that, right? If what you really wanted is the people who judge the best in accordance with following the letter of the law, then why isn't that the system that we put into place? And
Hmm.
well, there's probably several reasons. but I think that one of them is that this is one of the places where the voice of the people can push back when laws become overbearing, right? This was one of the, we've gone so far from this in the US, but originally, one of the basic ideas was laws become very overbearing and very oppressive. And so we built this system that has all these ways of pushing back against laws, right? Or controlling the jurisdiction of laws and all these things. And I believe that that's one of them. And it's by design. Like, look, if you don't think, I don't know, rather than make up some weird case that's a bad illustration, I'll just say, if you think that people are being oppressed by an unjust law and you get called into a jury involving a case on which that law has bearing, then you have the right as somebody born here or a citizen, right? A citizen of this country. You don't have to be born here to be a citizen. You have the right to exercise whatever power has been given you as a member of the jury in that moment, right? And they don't like to hear that.
Well,
but I didn't want to do.
Apparently, you don't have
so,
that right because you got. Apparently, you don't have that right because you got counted as you got struck off the list in both cases.
Well, I would have the right if I kept it to myself. Yeah.
I'm very skeptical about the ability of systems to keep power in check, which is in a way an elite theory point.
It's a fundamental problem, right? So even just talking about laws, like laws in all modern countries are completely absurd. Nobody knows what they are. Like I don't know what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do.
Yeah,
like,
you think you're not allowed to walk geese in front of Parliament, or there's all these weird bylaws in the UK at least that have been around for hundreds of years.
But I mean, the thing is, sometimes laws expire, but usually they don't, and people just keep writing new ones. And so the number of words of demands that you must comply with as just a normal guy trying to go through your life just grows every day, like to a tremendous degree. And at several levels of government, right? You have your local level and the national level, and they all just keep writing laws. And so it's kind of stupid, because if the idea is that you're supposed to comply with laws, how can you possibly do that? There's obviously some ones like, okay, don't kill people or whatever, but okay. Apart from that, what are all these other pages of laws for?
We're so trained to think in terms of the written rules and laws. I think we should think about relationships. You have a relation to the people who rule over you, and indeed to the enforcers, the police or whoever it is in the middle. And if there's a law, so I was thinking about this. For example, I was sitting at a set of traffic lights a while back, and it was in the middle of a roundabout, so I could see down every road that was relevant for an enormous distance. And I was sitting with a robot that was telling me to wait, and I just thought, this is stupid, I'm gonna go. And I just drove through the red light and was like, now did I do something wrong? I'm pronomian, and I like law, and I like to live in a system of justice and order. So, and I don't want to be somebody who is just petty and disobedient. But once I have sufficient understanding to know why the rule has been put in place, who the people who put it in place are, and what their actual interests are, and if me breaking that rule is of no concern, it's like they genuinely don't care, then I don't think that law has any actual hold on me at that point. The things that matter are the laws that I've been made aware of that they can catch me for, or if I'm independently going to cause an accident, But yes.
Well, so obviously, you're taking a matter into your own personal judgment in that moment. Judgment can be flawed, which is one of the reasons why we have laws. I mean, of course, you can
Yeah.
come up with a case where it's arbitrarily obvious that it's not, but you know
Well, I
that is a
took
thing.
yeah, I
But
took the responsibility to say if something was to happen as a result of my choice, then
yeah,
I would accept my culpability before the legal system that I was breaking the law and then therefore
yes,
more culpable because of that.
I
And
think
I,
most people would not do that. Um, but you know, like I somebody backed into my car and scratched it up the other month and then drove off. Um,
ah,
yeah. But okay, here's the interesting point though is, and I'm not sure I'm super well equipped to talk about this because it's not something I think about too much, but
mhm,
there is like a second order effect of what societal cohesion or lack thereof happens due to the way people behave under these circumstances, right? It's sort of like surface
mhm,
tension on water or something, right? You have all the water molecules, but they hold together or they don't. And
mm,
you can observe really interesting differences in this. So, for example, last time I was in Tokyo, I was in a hotel that was in a sort of near some streets that were very small streets, like one or two lanes, very little traffic, and crosswalks like there are all over Tokyo. And I would be standing there at the crosswalk, and there were all these Japanese citizens, and very obviously no cars anywhere around. And even if there were, the cars would be going, 15 miles an hour or whatever. And they just stand there at the crosswalk until it says
mm,
go, right? Which certainly in the US, that's not how that would happen. Probably most Western countries I've been in, I don't think it's just like people would cross and they wouldn't
yeah,
feel like they're doing something wrong. They would think about it as, this crosswalk is here for situations in which it's needed, which might
mm,
be, rush hour or times in the day when there's more traffic. Right now, it's obviously not necessary. And so, whereas I'm technically violating, I guess, the law, or we wouldn't even think about it that way, but like I'm
you've got
disobeying
jaywalking
the
laws in the
crosswalk
US,
right
right?
now. Yeah. But it's fine that I'm disobeying the crosswalk because it's obviously useless at this moment in time, right?
Ah,
And but in Japan apparently they don't think about it that way, right? They have a quite
ah,
different viewpoint. And okay,
ah,
so what are the consequences of these different perspectives? And it's very
mm,
hard. I'm sure there are some consequences that have benefits and drawbacks in each direction, but it's just very hard to tally these and get a
mm.
score like 17 or 18 because there's just so many other factors also feeding in, right?
Also, the effect is social and corporate. If a individual Western person moved to Japan, I think they would pretty quickly fall into the patterns that they see around them. So it's not that they've got a deep, individually rooted ideology that's leading their decision making. They're just copying the pattern of the people, which is very useful human behavior for us to cooperate by behaving the same way as one another. But the reason that the Japanese people are behaving a certain way is probably goes all the way back to a broader honor culture and an expectation of so like in I've heard that in business there is in Japan an understanding that the profit of the company is less important than saving face for the people that you're dealing with, so they could actually deliberately enter into a business contract with somebody knowing that it won't be profitable for either party, but because there's a wider understanding of the impact on the reputations of the two parties if the contract doesn't happen. Just a totally different way of thinking things through. And you could go the opposite direction and find places in the world um, which are the other direction from that, right? You could go
Yeah.
in Japan to US to another country line and find a less uh, I don't know what the I don't know what the word would be. It's kind of you could describe the Japanese approach either as very stifling, but also as very orderly and proper and
Yeah.
kind of
Um,
cooperative. So
and different observation I made on the same trip in Beijing, which is not that far from Japan, relatively speaking, to where I am today. You know, relative to the scale of the world, um, completely the opposite. So like
Huh.
downtown
Interesting.
Beijing, you'll have these like just big streets going through the city that are something like no, they got to be like at least 12 lanes, like six on each side. And it's a free for all. Like drivers don't care
Wow.
about where the lane markers are.
Huh.
There's just
Really
cars just trying to fit in wherever they can. It looks like a complete nightmare to try to drive there.
interesting.
I wouldn't ever try. But it's
So
so the
that's the
polar
Chinese
opposite of
versus
Tokyo.
Japanese. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
it's pretty impressive actually.
Um, I'm I'm not sure that having a jury of your peers is actually a smart idea. I'm increasingly convinced that um, we would be better off with professional jurors. Um,
Maybe. I mean, I'm every time I look into the way the US legal system
mm,
works, it's very ill defined because
okay.
it's built on like English common law, which is not actually written down, apparently.
Mm,
And I mean, it is written down in the form of like, things like the Magna Carta, but then there's all sorts of stuff after that happened that's just like, you're just supposed to know when you're a judge about what the I don't know. It's very strange. And so when the U.S. legal system was codified, it was like, well, there's English common law at the heart of it, and then here's some things that we're doing on top. And so I don't know. A lot of the time, a case in the U.S. can be argued on the basis of vaguely ill-defined concepts of human rights, from hundreds of years ago,
mm,
and which is interesting because you can get very specific about writing down all these laws, but they're in a sense overpowered by tradition, I
mm,
guess. Um,
hmm. I
Maybe we're losing that
I'm
over
not.
time. I don't know.
There's a part of me that wants to steer towards the version of legal proceedings that we imagine, where people are genuinely trying their hardest to understand the legal code like an algorithm and just apply
Yeah.
it like a stamp. On the other hand, I think about the vision of modernity that Kafka paints, where you can get caught up in this horrible mechanism of systems and like outdated loopholes, and you've fallen through the cracks of this law, and now you're put in an impossible situation, and you just wish that you could talk to a person and the person would not put you in this stupid situation. Actually, the fact that the legal system ultimately is individual humans making decisions, there's the downside of that. These people are going to be biased and emotional and all of these things, but the opposite is also pretty horrific, I think. Like there's a lot to be worried about when the system gets gunged up in algorithmic. Like the algorithms that we write are always bad approximations of the perfect function for the legal system to be.
Yeah, I mean, you
So
need you need people in there with good judgment to do something
yeah,
that's fair, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just hard. It's a hard problem.
yeah. Right. I'm going to give you 15 for that.
All right,
And
my score's going down.
well, you picked um, a rough round there, but
Yeah.
let's see: technology, natural sciences, or
Let's do
Christology.
technology. I know some things about some areas of technology.
Do you? People will always choose convenience over privacy. Virtual reality will pacify the oppressed masses. Or Silicon Valley is a transhumanist cult.
So I have to argue for one of these.
No,
I don't
no, you
have.
can argue
Can I
against.
flip it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. I'll
absolutely.
argue against virtual reality will pacify the oppressed masses. I don't think that's true.
Okay.
Um, and the reason I don't think that's true uh, is because we already have basically all that we need to pacify the oppressed masses. Like, um, like a video game, for example, uh, is very immersive, right? You get really, well, especially dudes who tend to be, goal oriented.
Mm.
That'll get me canceled saying that. Whatever. Um,
Yeah.
but we know that generally video games are more popular with young men especially,
Yeah.
and it in part that's because uh, they just hook into psychology in a certain way, right? And
Mm.
it can be a very negative thing. Like people can get addicted to games. They can get
Seems like social media apps have the same potency for young women.
well, and also for young men, like for everybody, really. Maybe more. Maybe it's lopsided in a different way, but I know plenty of males who spend way too much time on social media. I think in part you get different things out of it, right? Because if you want to argue and fight, you can do that on Twitter, and if you want
Yeah.
to have different social interactions and see people and things and display yourself, you can do that on Instagram or whatever, right?
Hmm.
So maybe
Hmm.
there are different places for different people. Um,
Mm.
but I think so. When I ask, what do you get from putting a helmet on your head? Although we can imagine the technology getting better to the point where that's less of a thing. But what do you get from that? It's more immersive, but again, we've already got the level of immersion that you need to like get somebody hooked on things already. And um, I'm not sure that pretending like you're actually in a space gives you anything.
Mm.
Like I'm actually starting design on a virtual reality game right now for the first time,
Mm.
and I'm taking a very contrarian method of designing it because a lot of people design for the immersion and the fantasy of being in a space, and I just don't think most of those games are very good. So I'm designing practically around the things that objectively are true when you're doing virtual reality, which is things like you have very good tracking over the controllers and your headset, right? And
Mm.
you there's a very much more natural one-to-one relationship. Like you can reach out, you can gauge distances between things, and you can reach out accurately to touch things in space in a way that you can't with a mouse and keyboard, right?
Mm.
And so I'm designing from that standpoint. So I kind of just don't believe this whole thesis that virtual reality gives you really anything.
Mm.
Maybe in the far future, you would have to go far enough in the future that I don't know, like I can have some experience where I'm just walking around and it's just like the real world, and I have all the girlfriends I want, and they're all supermodels, whatever, that kind of a thing. At that point, you could make an argument that this statement is true, but I think long before we get to that point,
Hmm.
we'll already have all the pacification we need. You don't need that much.
Is there diminishing returns? Because I I think there is something about realism that makes a game more compelling. People, is this true? Are people are people more likely to become addicted to a game that, let's say, the very early days, right? So Pong, and then I don't know, Mario, like,
Yeah.
versus I don't know, Call of Duty.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, there's a lot more realism in Call of Duty, and you could then imagine, okay, the next step on that journey is putting the headset on.
Yeah,
Um,
but what's addictive is not exactly realism. Although,
no,
again, if you come to it as I want to live out my fantasy, then maybe realism. Although maybe a tune shaded world or something is just as good for a lot of people. But what
yeah,
actually? So when you get addicted to a game, it's a subtler, deeper process than that. It's like your brain is getting stimuli and feedback to your actions that the brain considers to be satisfying. And
mm,
our brains are very good at just remapping their understanding of the world, right? Like if you hold a
mm,
hammer, you become very good at feeling that as an extension of your arm. Like you don't have to like think really hard about that, right?
Mm.
There's all sorts of brain experiments that show how well your brain adjusts to things, but all I will say for this is like for that addiction component, there what is actually important is that your actions uh, produce feedback, both audio and visual feedback, that have a lot of detail to them, like a lot of texture to them. So when you slash with a sword in a game and there's like all these particles flying off when you get a good hit
Yeah.
and whatever, that's things
Hmm.
that older games didn't have as much of because
Hmm.
well, games hadn't progressed that far and it was harder to do that on older computers and stuff. And so those things actually make games more addictive. And then you can go back to B.F. Skinner's work, for example, to see that another component that is required is a degree of unpredictability,
Mm.
because that's what keeps your brain
Right.
trying to figure out the system. You need a large degree of predictability because predictability is like playability, right? Like I'm
Mm.
making decisions about what I'm going to do and they're trying to be good decisions and I need to have a model in my mind of what the rules of this game world are in order to make decisions, right? If you didn't have that, everything would just be random and the game would not only not be addictive, it would not be playable, right?
Mm.
But if everything's perfectly predictable, then things become boring because
Mm.
at some point you're just like, okay, this is just nothing is new here. I'm just done,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Hence loot boxes.
well, loot boxes is one. That's a way to give people randomized rewards. But even within a game, like very subtle things, like if every time I shoot if every time my magic missile hits a target and makes a little explosion, if that explosion is pretty different every time, that's a lot more
Mm.
engaging than if
Hmm.
it's the same every time. Because your
Hmm.
brain looks at that. It's like people trying to play, slot machines in Las Vegas and they're trying to
Yeah.
get the pattern that'll help them win. Your brain is always trying to do that. So it's like, oh,
Mm.
that the way the particles flew off that magic missile looked 5% better than last time. Maybe I did more damage. Maybe the exact way that I pushed the mouse button at the right time
Yeah.
cause that. In reality, it was the same magic missile, right? But you might think your brain deep down thinks it's better and that there's something it can improve on and that
Hmm.
there's some further benefit to be derived from this. And that's what video game addiction is actually.
Hmm. So maybe realism isn't the right lens, but if there are elements of the game that make it more compelling, we've got the technology to render these gorgeous visuals, and the sound is so crisp and satisfying. And when you complete the goal, you get this overwhelm of dopamine because of how incredible the things that you're experiencing are. Does putting on the headset and having this more compelling human control system mean that you can tap into, you can almost like flood the brain even more fully with a flood of dopamine?
So far, I don't have reason to believe that's true. I will say so realism. I've been making the argument that realism is not necessary. It is correlated in the sense that you mentioned Pong, for example, which is the ultimate minimalist game. It's not only not realism, but it's like almost not anything, right? There's just like a little line segment on the screen, and so Pong doesn't have very many channels of communication to talk to your brain, right? Whereas
Mm.
something like a much more modern, very detailed game does have more channels of communication to your brain. And so realism correlates with that because realism means a
Mm.
lot of detail. It also means fidelity to what you see in the real world. I don't think that's as important as actually just having the level of detail. In fact,
Mm.
I think if it's more different from the world, that's more for your brain to figure out, and that might be more
Yeah.
addictive, actually. And
I mean,
and
I've
does
sometimes
that
seen
require a headset? I don't think so.
I've seen the opposite happen. Yeah, if I've spent hours playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and I go out and see a railing, my brain has learnt the affordance that I can like press triangle and a skateboard will pop onto my feet, and I almost expect to be able to do that in the real world. So I'm so engrossed in the virtual world that my brain has started to learn the virtual world is what matters and is important, and the real world is kind of this secondary location that you visit from time to time.
Yeah. So in my last ditch effort to get a couple extra points here, let me go
Oh
back to
yes,
the pacification angle. So I've
yeah.
been saying video games because that's what we have right now, but that's not, that's not the ultimate pacification. As we've been discussing, I think in various places around the internet, the actual pacification is when everybody can have an AI girlfriend who's hot, right?
Huh.
Because so you've probably heard it said, and I think it's true. It's more true when you're younger, but it's been said about males that all these things that men do at some level are ultimately to try to impress a woman to get with them, and that's why we try so hard. That's why you learn to play guitar and be in the band and all
I
these
don't think that's
things.
why anybody gets to level 60 in World of Warcraft, though.
I don't think so either. So obviously there's a limit to the explanatory power there, but I think there's a degree to which that's true. And
Sure.
so as soon as you have an AI girlfriend, okay, not only do you not have to achieve things, which is the angle that people have taken so far, but like, why do you think your AI girlfriend is going to be ideologically neutral? Like we've already seen the tremendous
Mm.
amount of spinning of subject matter that goes on in web searches or what you see in a social media feed and all this. So like
Hmm.
obviously your AI girlfriend is going to reward or punish you for ideological things. So forget, right now there's all this coercion that you have, sociological coercion just based on you said the wrong thing on Twitter and everybody got mad at you or something. Well,
Hmm.
okay, now that'll be your so-called girlfriend doing that to you nonstop at a degree that's so subtle that you don't really detect it, right? Because
Ah.
we know all about that. Like if you have a prisoner of war and you want to convert them ideologically, you start with very small things and you get them to admit like the United States is not in fact the best country in the world of all time because of some small thing or that it did something wrong, and you just get that little wedge and you just keep prying it open more and more slowly every day. So that's that, and that has nothing to do with virtual reality. That's in real reality. So it's the
Hmm.
AI girlfriend, man.
So, in total, your argument is there are already sufficient tools
So
for
many
oppression
ways.
that
Yeah.
virtual reality is basically meaningless.
I mean,
I buy that argument.
I,
I think you're right.
and as somebody who grew up decades ago at this point, I see a big difference between how people act now and how they acted
Huh.
when I was growing up. And when I was growing up, people seemed freer. I'll just say that. And
Hmm.
so we don't even have all this technology, and already I feel like I'm living in a world that is much worse socially
Hmm.
than the one that I saw. So
Yeah. Sidebar on freedom, because I agree with you, and in particular that there are big changes and that they have generally been negative. I guess that's the position that people get when they become old at at all times. But
well, I think, I mean, that's true probably, but I
but
think
also they were right.
in this case, there are specific things. It's not just a general nostalgia.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that freedom is. So, for example, the big claim of democracy is that it's rule of the people by the people,
Yeah,
and that therefore the people are free. And I actually think the only thing that matters is it's rule for the people. If you've got a benevolent ruler who's genuinely ruling in the interests of the people, that's probably a better situation, because I
you could get
do
things
not
done
think
better.
I
Yeah,
don't think that the people are very good at self rule. They will decide all kinds of things against their own interests. Um, so I'm much more interested in the things that people are subjected to than whether the
yeah,
people chose those things. And in some ways, I even would say a lack of freedom to choose bad things is preferable than the freedom to choose bad things in most cases. And even just choice in general, like the classic observation that if you got a choice between 7 things instead of 2 things, you'll probably be less happy with the one that you end up with.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Even if the one that you chose is slightly better suited to you, but you're so full of regret about the 6 things that you missed out on. Okay, are you good to go for last round? I think.
Oh, okay, great.
Literature, software and mathematics, or eschatology?
I mean, we got to do software and mathematics. We're gonna stay in places where I have a hope of knowing something about something.
Well, you know, I've had quite a few guests on the show at this point, and they all know that I'm a programmer. So nobody else has chosen this topic for fear.
Okay.
In your case, lots of my programming opinions have come from listening to you. So
my problem
you're a fairly
is
safe place.
my problem is the only one of these that I'm interested in at all is the second one.
Yeah, these are randomly chosen from quite a long list of topics, so I can give you some more options if you want.
Yeah, let's re-scramble it because I think that second one has a lot of overlap with how we started the conversation.
Well, yeah, indeed. It will give me a second to pull up my list of questions, which
we need like some serious programming questions here.
While I'm looking for it, tabs or spaces?
I mean,
VMs or containers? No, where are the questions?
Yeah. No, tabs are kind of dumb. I'll just say that.
Yeah,
tabs are dumb.
Well, as a general observation, after I left university, I think I was a worse programmer in almost every measurable respect than I was before I went to uni, and that included being a big tab proponent. And I fell into the functional programming kind of ideology.
Yeah, I was just at a functional programming conference a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
How did you end up there?
Well, they invited me to come talk because I make a programming language. And
does J?
It's not a very functional programming language, but I think they just sort of want to expand the conference into more of a people who are interested in different programming languages. And so I think that was an experiment in venturing outside the functional thing. You could ask them, I guess, if they thought that was successful, but yeah.
I mean, there are definitely some interesting insights that come out of the functional programming world that I value. I mean,
there are, but they're also just, the problem is the functional language community dogmatically believes all those things to great excess and to their own detriment.
Yes.
Yeah. But all programming paradigms are worth learning. It's like if you don't understand how functional languages are and what they're like if you only ever programmed like in C and you never saw these other things, that's not that good for someone's growth as a programmer. They really should have tried some of this stuff.
Yeah, I was genuinely like, in 50 years, everything's going to be monads and.
Okay, yeah, that's the kind of person who was at this conference. So you would
have. I would have if I'd have had a time machine. Okay, let me read you a bunch of these quickly, and you can tell me if any of them take your fancy.
All right.
Software engineers have an ethical obligation to write good code.
Oh, that's an easy one. I've ranted about that before, but yeah.
Open source should be considered harmful. Consumers should have a right to repair their products. There's quite a few Richard Stallman ones in here. Dynamic linking is unnecessary.
Let's do the first one because it actually matters. Right. And I think people could relate to this even as non-programmers, but as people who use software, right?
Okay.
And actually, I'll take the first two. We'll do again.
Sure.
I'm going to answer the first two. The second one was open source should be considered a crime of some kind or whatever.
Yeah.
So both of these together, and I'll just start with the open source to link it back, which is just the whole open source idea right now is that there's all these projects on GitHub or whatever. And not only is the source available, but that all kinds of people contribute, right? They contribute back. And then it creates this culture where like you're somebody in open source if you get your project on GitHub and it has a lot of stars and then a lot of people are engaging with it and giving you patches back, right? And so it leads to this thing where people just want to be open source heroes and they And so there's this culture of like, I slapped some software together. It barely kind of works. It's not that different from the 17 other things that barely kind of work that claim to do this thing. I'm putting it on
Yeah.
GitHub and I'm getting my name out there. It's like tagging a building, right? Which
Hmm.
is American slang for graffiti that people
Yeah.
may not all
I know
know.
that from Tony
Um,
Hawk.
okay, there you go. So so why is that bad? Well, it's the first point, which is that it's actually an ethical obligation to make sure your software is good in proportion to how widely used it is, right? So suppose your dreams come true and only 10,000 people use your program, which is not that big of a number, right?
Mm.
Compared to, how many people use Microsoft Windows or iOS or something, or even a game like the games that I've made. I actually couldn't tell you how many millions of people have played them, but it's two digits. It's a two-digit number. I don't know if it's a low two-digit number or a higher one because there's like piracy and all these things. Also, I just don't keep very close accounting. But
Sure.
but
Yeah.
okay. So but for let's just say let's start with a number like 10,000, right?
Hmm.
And now let's say, as is common in open source, right, but also other software, let's just say the documentation isn't very good. We're not even talking about the
Mm.
quality of the actual software yet. It's just a little bit hard to use, or it doesn't explain something very clearly. And so the 10,000 people uh, who are using this software each spend about 6 minutes trying to do something that they should have been able to do immediately. They're just figuring it out, right?
Mm.
So so by not fixing this simple documentation problem before sending off the software, you have wasted 60,000 minutes of people's lives, which, because there's 60 minutes in an hour, that's 1,000 hours, right?
Yeah.
Which is a long time. That's not like an astronomical number, but we have chosen two numbers that are very low. We said 6 minutes of time wasted, and we said only 10,000 people use the software. Imagine a million people use your software, and it has several problems. Let's say it takes a minute to 2 minutes to start up in the beginning, right? So you're wasting 2 million minutes of people's time per time they launch the software before you're even talking about dealing with problems. Let's say
Mm.
crashes happen sometimes that cause people to lose their work. Let's say it's just a lot more confusing than it should be, right? Let's say it's slower than it should be to like render the result of what you're working on if it's some creative piece of software. There's all these problems that happen that lead to wasted time. Let's say even technically you might not be wasting somebody's time with the way something is done, but the interactivity is aggravating. Like you're making them hold down keys and it's like annoying. And you're just causing them to have a lower quality of life for those minutes when they're using the thing than they would otherwise, right? And then you start computing these numbers. And very quickly, if you have a million people using something, and you waste a day per person, which is really not very hard for software that's heavily used, that's a million days of life that you flush down the toilet, which, I mean, 1,000 days is about 3 years, right? So
Hmm.
3,000 years of life that you have thrown away by not doing a better job.
Wow.
And that's only 1 day per person, which the numbers can easily get much worse than that. So it is very clearly an ethical obligation. Like when you put bad software out in the world, it's like dumping trash into the environment, right? You're creating an
Mm.
externality that other people have to deal with. And,
Mm.
you don't suffer from putting the trash in the environment. In fact, you probably benefit because you got your thing out there sooner and you didn't have to put as much work in. So you made more money per unit time. Or if it's free, you got more exposure and popularity per unit time that you worked on the thing. But yeah, it's like you're putting a toxin in the environment. And I
Yeah.
don't think that should be done.
If you operated a factory and it was turned out to be poisoning a village, then that village can sue the factory, and they do some calculation. I don't know if there has ever been a class action lawsuit, but what if everybody sued Microsoft for making Word load up slowly, and decided that it was
I don't think they would
costing
win
them?
that lawsuit, but, yeah.
But I guess the opposite thought is, Okay, if you publish a package to the internet that becomes extremely popular, like you
Yeah.
say, you could theoretically end up wasting enough human life, like enough seconds of people sitting staring at their computers because of your faulty code, that it totals the length of an average human life.
Oh,
Now,
easily. Yeah.
should that be considered equivalent to manslaughter? You've effectively destroyed a human's life worth of
I think
time
it's a little
from
bit different because that
society.
life didn't go away, but it was spent like sitting there frustrated, not doing anything. So it's more like if you took somebody hostage and imprisoned them for the rest of their life, which is also something we wouldn't look kindly upon, right? But
No,
it's not quite murder. But saying
you,
one
you
person,
could get a life sentence for that at least.
yeah. But again, because of the branching factors we would call them in computers involved, which is just the number of people that can use things.
Hmm.
It's easily not one person. It's easily like 1,000 people in prison for their life or whatever, which would be, you're starting to talk about
A
serious
sort of
war
war
crimes.
crime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, and that's just what we do casually all the time in software. It's just
Yeah.
kind of terrible.
Although I suppose on the flip side, that software's probably led to lots of benefits to society. So maybe it's closer to the
Well,
analogy might be you built a hospital and it produced like all this
there's
good
also a
for
thousand people in
humanity.
the basement of the hospital. Wait, where have I heard that before?
Isn't that the
So,
story of leaving Omelas, right? Those who left
oh, yeah. I actually
Omelas.
never read that, but I know the basic idea of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a short story where there's a city that's incredible, and it's kind of described to the reader as you can picture whatever utopian city that you like, and then there's a secret that, or it's not a secret. It's known that there's a single poor suffering child who's living in deprivation, and you can go and visit the child. And several of the people who do visit, after they've seen the horrific existence that this one person has, that is allowing in some undefined way the rest of the city to exist, they just walk away and leave the city. And it kind of leaves you with the moral question of what things in our life, what things in the real world are equivalent to that, because it's probably quite a lot of society runs that way.
Yeah, it's dangerous though. These are dangerous waters to think about because it's very easy to make an intellectual mistake, So
Sure.
one thing we can't go into this, not least because we're out of time mostly, but I
Yeah.
also have to get
Yeah.
on a plane. But there's
Sure.
one of the people who put forth the ideas that eventually turned into the uh, effective altruism movement is the philosopher
Mm.
Peter Singer, who makes a case that I thought was obviously persuasive at some point when I read it, and now I think is obviously totally wrong. But he
Mm.
makes the point like, look, all human lives are equally valuable, and so therefore you
Mm.
should care as much about somebody on the other side of the planet who you don't know as you do someone in your family. And so
Mm.
you should spend an equal amount of money supporting both. And if you don't, then you're evil. And therefore, basically, all people are evil.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that that's deeply flawed in certain ways, which maybe we can get into. I don't know. Next
Another
time I
time.
release a game and come on the show. But it's easy to convince yourself from this
Yeah.
sort of there's a sort of like a modern Western comfortable person perspective from which ideas like that seem to make sense. You know, and I I watch out for
Yeah.
minefields full of those lately because they're just very
Yeah.
easy to trip over.
Yeah, I've had a similar journey with Peter Singer, and it's one of the lines of thought that led me to deciding that ethics is relational, which I mentioned earlier. Um, that somebody once said that to me as just they dropped that bombshell idea into my world, and I've kind of completely retooled the way I think about everything because of it.
It's a very
Um,
good idea for people to contend with in their own mind, right? Because it's like, wait, does this make sense? Do I have to immediately change all my behavior or else I'm evil
hmm,
or what? And just to wrestle with the argument
hmm,
is
hmm.
is very interesting, I think.
Well, I'm going to give you 19 points. You're ending on a high,
Okay.
and now it's
feel
time
good.
to see the high score table, which I have to manually refresh because I threw this together.
Okay.
And you're at the top. You
Wait,
are the
how is
winner
that?
so
Oh,
far of
because
the
it's 6
Gauntlet.
questions. It's
Yes.
okay. Yeah, I thought it was 5. I was like, how did I get over here?
How did
All
I
right.
go over?
Well,
Yeah.
I feel great.
Congratulations. Look at all these people that you stomped on.
I am the top scoring at the fully arbitrary,
Correct.
obviously completely fair scoring system. I would like
Exactly.
to thank my agent and all the little people who were there for me.
No matter how Anniversary of Parade does at awards season, you can look back on 2024 and know that you at least won this.
Oh yeah, I doubt I'm ever winning any awards again for the rest of my life. I'm too much on the wrong side of the orthodoxy. So
Everybody's.
who knows?
Mm,
Maybe
mm.
that'll turn out not to be true. But yeah,
Thanks so much for joining me once again, and yeah, I hope to have you back sometime.
yeah, right on. This was fun. I didn't. I
Great.
was skeptical about the idea of a game show format, but it worked out because it really is. It's an interesting way to introduce random topics, as you said, that you wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily have talked about.
Apart from the highly autistic segment of my audience who get annoyed at the arbitrary nature of the scoring, I think most people enjoy it. So I think
Well,
it's
I
been a
enjoy it
success.
because I'm ahead by 4 points
That's
of
one of the
everybody.
reasons all the guests enjoy it. Because there's some people have accused me of grade inflation, but
Yeah,
this is a spurious claim, and
yeah.
they've got right.
Unfounded. They have no respect for the system that
No,
makes all these things possible. All
great.
right. Thanks, everyone.